Well, we've got a strong foreign affairs team within the Conservative caucus, and we work together on a range of different issues. My focus has generally been on human rights, as well as on Canada's relationship with Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and within that as well, looking for ways to strengthen our engagement with Canadian diaspora communities on foreign policy issues. I think Canada can play a stronger role on human rights and on building partnerships with free democracies and with freedom-seeking people and groups within all parts of the world. So that's been my focus in my time in this position, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Andrew Scheer, our leader, and our team are going to be able to do to strengthen Canada's engagement on the world stage, our commitment to human rights, and our work on strengthening freedom and democracy. Well, clearly negotiations with Mr. Trump and the American government were never going to be easy, but I think we saw in particular some real strategic failures from this government. One of those was focusing on non-binding language around social issues, essentially trying to change domestic policy in the United States instead of putting the primary emphasis on jobs and opportunity for Canadians. So we saw a number of strategic failures that led in the end to significant concessions. And in spite of those concessions, tariffs remained in place. So Canada under Justin Trudeau is projecting weakness on the world stage, weakness with our allies, weakness with our strategic adversaries, and that has real consequences in terms of trade in this case and other cases that are unfortunately making life more expensive for Canadians. Well, our relationship with Indiana, relationship with China are both very important issues in our foreign policy, and there's very different dynamics. In terms of our relationship with China, China is not a rule of law country. It doesn't have independence of institutions, and effectively that means that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, is, regardless of any agreement, able to totally control our access to their economy at the same time as using their businesses to advance their political objectives here in Canada. And that means that we need to be very cautious in our engagement with China to ensure that it is engagement that is reflective of our values and our interests. Unfortunately, the Liberals have been very naive when it comes to dealing with China. Initially, Justin Trudeau expressed a lot of admiration, even praising China's basic dictatorship. They wanted to negotiate a free trade deal with China. They even were willing to open up discussions about an extradition agreement with China. And in the end, by continually stepping backwards in response to Chinese demands, we looked weak, and we brought ourselves to a situation where we are today, where we haven't improved. In fact, relations have significantly worsened with China. We're seeing attacks on our industries, farmers, and on other industries. So what do we need to be doing in response to that? We need to be projecting strength. We need to be challenging China at the WTO. We need to actually appoint an ambassador to China. We haven't had an ambassador for a number of months after the former Liberal cabinet minister who was an ambassador to China had to resign in disgrace. So the current government has really, through its naivety and its inconsistency and its lack of foresight, put our businesses at risk in the context of that relationship. The solution to that is not capitulation, but it's strength in the face of what's going on, and really a healthy suspicion, recognizing the realities of the Chinese system as it presently exists. And that recognition should lead us to pursue greater trading relations with like-minded partners, with democracies in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world. And clearly, as we pursue those closer commercial ties with other democracies, that doesn't mean that we're always going to agree. It doesn't mean that we're going to avoid tough negotiations. And Canadian strength is important in that engagement as well. India's political system is obviously much more like ours, and that provides more opportunities. We've got got strong people-to-people ties with India as well. But we need to be hard-headed in our negotiations to make sure we're always upholding Canadian interests and Canadian values in that case as well. Of course, Justin Trudeau's trip to India was a total disaster. It was not effective as a commercial exercise, and he really embarrassed Canada. I think a big part of that was his failure to take India seriously, his failure to focus on work, on Canada's interests. And I think there are opportunities for greater engagement with India, with other democracies in the region. But as the question suggests, we need to always be looking out for Canadian interests and Canadian values in the context of those negotiations as well. Well, I think there are needs and opportunities for engagement in all of those areas. I think increased engagement with Pakistan, and one thing mentioned in that question, Canada has a large Indian and Pakistani diaspora community, which makes me think that we could play more of a constructive role, even trying to facilitate greater peace and cooperation between those countries within that region. And I think there may well be an opportunity to do more of that. Under the Conservative government, we were engaged through the Office of Religious Freedom in programs in Pakistan promoting pluralism and working with the Aga Khan Foundation on the production of pro-pluralism textbooks. So cooperative engagement with Pakistan to try and promote these kind of values: pluralism, peace, democracy, and recognizing the strength that comes from our diaspora community, I think is something that is very worthwhile. Our engagement with Turkey, of course, is challenged by the backsliding in terms of democracy and human rights that we've seen in Turkey. That doesn't mean we should disengage. We need to be present and engaged and forceful in terms of our values, but we need also to recognize the challenges that the current Turkish regime presents, and not close our eyes to that. Strengthen engagement with the Gulf Arab states, absolutely very important. We have opportunities for economic cooperation, strategic cooperation, and I believe that Canada needs to be engaged throughout the world with countries who share our values in every respect, in some respects, and not at all. But we always need to make sure that our engagement is reflective of our interests and our values, and that we're promoting pluralism, strong civil society, democracy, and we're doing that through dialogue, through soft power. I think we've got a unique opportunity. Our leader spoke about this during his foreign policy speech, highlighting the particular competencies of Canada to be a leader in this respect. The fact that we have a lot of diversity within our country, we have strong people-to-people ties with many countries around the world. We have a positive domestic experience of pluralism that we can lead from in our engagement with the world, and we don't have a colonial history beyond our borders. These are all things that are particular advantages for us in our engagement around the world. That's a great question. Under the previous Conservative government, we did move forward and negotiate a free trade deal between Canada and the EU. Stephen Harper's government, of course, known for aggressively pursuing free trade deals with many countries around the world, but in particular with like-minded democracies with shared values. There's a great opportunity now with that free trade deal moving forward to open up more trade with Europe. One area that I'd highlight for particular cooperation is in the area of energy. Many European countries are very dependent on energy imports from Russia, and this is a source of insecurity for them. And Canada can benefit its own economy while benefiting European security by working to export more of our energy resources to Europe. Of course, getting there requires the construction of pipeline infrastructure. Andrew Scheer has now put out a policy to have an east to west corridor, a corridor for transportation infrastructure, including energy infrastructure pipelines. Getting our energy resources from Alberta to the East Coast can help to create jobs in upgrading and refining on the East Coast, economic opportunity there, economic opportunity for the whole country. But that energy cooperation with Europe has a particular impact on the security front that I think benefits both partners. So on the issue of illegal immigration, certainly we're very concerned about the emerging phenomenon of people coming to Canada from a safe country claiming asylum. One thing that's been flagged in the Auditor General's report, we desperately need to strengthen and speed up the asylum determination system. When people are coming here and they're not having their asylum claims heard for years and years, it means a real vulnerability in terms of our system. It's not fair to those who are trying to come the right way. So we need to clean up the mess that has been left with that system, and that means a number of different measures. One of them is ensuring speed and certainty in terms of that asylum process. Another issue is tone, right? I mean, the tone set from the top by Justin Trudeau has been to, I think, falsely imply that anyone can come to Canada, and I think anyone who has immigrated to Canada understands that look, we have a generous, open, compassionate immigration system, but it is supposed to be a rules-based system. You have to fill out applications and go through the process, and you have to have the right criteria apply to you and apply through the right tracks. It's not a free-for-all. It's a fair system. It's an open, accessible system, but it's not a free-for-all. So the tone that's set from the top has to be a very different one, and will be a very different one. In terms of the impact on taxpayers from refugees from the Middle East and elsewhere, I think it's important to underline that many refugees, many immigrants who come through various other streams contribute significantly to the country culturally, but also economically. There are many immigrants, many refugees who will start businesses and employ Canadians. So we need to see the positive impact of that as well, and how we maximize the positive impact, I think, is by identifying those factors that help newcomers succeed and really accentuating and playing up those factors. So we know, for instance, that refugees who are privately sponsored to come to Canada, who come into existing communities of support, which can help them with employment and opportunity and integration, privately sponsored refugees tend to do much better than government-sponsored refugees. So recognizing that and wishing to help more people, as well as minimize the burden on taxpayers, we should be really emphasizing the private refugee sponsorship channel. Right now, with the Liberals, we have a cap on private sponsorship, while the public sponsorship is happening. So, if you diverted some of those resources from public sponsorship to supporting and facilitating more private sponsors, I think the data shows us that people would succeed much better once they got here. So, immigration, refugees can have a very positive impact on the country, including economically, but it's a question of how it's done and how it's managed. Again, not being a free-for-all, but instead ensuring that the system is rules-based and effective. Well, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of international students and the impact of international students working, and I know there's strong opinions that are being expressed kind of on both sides of some of the particular questions. I'll say this: I mean, there need to be clear rules that strike a balance. We currently allow students to work a little bit. We don't want them to be working too many hours so that they're competing with Canadians for employment, but we don't want to make sure that they have the opportunity to earn a little bit of money in order to sustain themselves and take care of their needs. So clearly there's a balance that needs to be struck. We need to have clear rules. The rules need to be enforced, and those rules, I think, should be discussed in terms of whether they do strike the right balance. So I understand the sensitivities. We do as Conservatives, and that's why I think we need to make sure that the rules strike the right balance and are fair and are being enforced. Well, the carbon tax is not an effective environmental plan. It's not an environmental plan at all. What we see from the Liberals is they're constantly using the environment as an excuse to raise taxes on everyday Canadians and small business owners at the same time as they're using the environment as an excuse to give big giveaways to well-connected insiders. They're giving millions of dollars to Loblaws to buy new refrigerators while they're asking you to pay more in the carbon tax. This is not a serious environmental plan. And during the time in which the carbon tax has been in place in British Columbia, gas prices have gone to the highest level in the country while emissions have still gone up. So we need a real serious environmental plan that addresses the challenges of climate change, but that does not use the environment as an excuse to raise your taxes. We can have a competitive economy and address our environmental challenges at the same time, and Andrew Scheer will do exactly that. Okay. A few different things there. I will say I think it's important for Canada to be a strong voice on the world stage for human rights. There's a moral imperative to standing up for human rights, but I think there's also a strategic imperative for us. If people who are suffering abuses of their human rights, wherever they are, know that Canada is on their side and that Canada is firm and consistent and principled in its commitment to justice and human rights, then that is how we gain friends and build influence around the world. And the spread of human rights, the spread of freedom and democracy makes us safe as well. It's in creating that space for more freedom and democracy, we strengthen our position in the world. We increase economic opportunities for trade. So being clear and consistent about our values is worthwhile. It is the right thing to do, and it serves our strategic interests. Now, of course, Canada, as a diverse country, hosts debates from different perspectives about different human rights issues, and I wouldn't call that drama. I think that's part of a free society. People might make arguments about human rights that other people disagree with, and different people with different experiences and different perspectives are going to obviously be a part of that conversation. In terms of the issue of human rights in Saudi Arabia and the Saudi teenager that was mentioned, I know there were some comments about whether or not it was wise from a perspective even of her own well-being to have a photo op done in the way it was, and I'll leave those questions to those who are kind of expert in the security dimensions of that. But we should be standing up on human rights in Saudi Arabia, and Conservatives have called on the government of Canada to do more and be more consistent in that. Saudi Arabia was elected to the UN Women's Rights Commission. Totally ridiculous that a country that has such a problem of respect for women's rights is put in a leadership role within the UN on women's rights. But I asked our foreign affairs minister, in keeping with the values of our so-called feminist foreign policy, if she would recognize that was a problem. And she simply refused to condemn or even criticize Saudi Arabia taking on this role in terms of the UN Women's Rights Commission. So I think we see with this government a lack of consistency on human rights issues, and that's been a problem. Another question that was part of that kind of group of questions was about events in India in 1984, the anti-Sikh pogroms, the terrible violence took place there, and I think it's important for us to remember these events, to recognize these events. I've made statements about them in the House of Commons, and I think for all Canadians to understand how kind of this kind of violence against a community does have a big effect on people. It has an effect on those who witnessed it, those who had people in their families experience it, on subsequent generations. So the steps we take to remember that, to promote reconciliation, and acknowledge that experience is very important. Just as we remember other acts of violence against communities. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and and coming out of the Holocaust, we said never again, that we wanted to never again see this kind of hatred and violence targeting a community. And yet, unfortunately, we see in large and small numbers people being targeted throughout the subsequent period of time on the basis of their ethnicity or their faith. And since I've been a member of Parliament, we've dealt with 2 cases of active genocide, at least one against the Rohingya in Burma, and the other against Yazidis and Christians at the hands of Daesh in Iraq and Syria. So these are terrible events. I think Canada can play a constructive role in making the promise of never again a reality, and in remembering violence of the past.